Frank Sinatra was the coolest man in Hollywood, but behind his shining blue eyes, he hid a chilling dark side. Since the early 1940s, the popularity of Frank Sinatra has remained unwavering. This slim, well-dressed kid from Hoboken, New Jersey, took the world by storm with his effortlessly smooth, distinct, and powerful voice, and few have matched his level of stardom since. However, behind the legendary voice and charismatic public image, Sinatra lived one of the most interesting lives of the 20th century, full of fun and games, as well as affairs, mob connections, the president snubbing him, his son being kidnapped, and tragic plane crashes, killing those he loved most. When Sinatra was born, the doctors tending to his mother were stunned. The baby was born blue and not breathing. They had to use forceps to forcefully yank him out of the womb by the head. Assuming that he didn't make it, they simply laid him on the table and began caring for his mother. And then his grandmother sprung into action. She put young Frank under a cold water tap, causing him to come to. This rough entry into the world gave him a scar on the side of his face, a feature which stayed with him for his whole life, at times causing him serious insecurity. For Sinatra, on top of the scars that he bore from his complicated birth, he also suffered from a punctured eardrum, and his problems didn't end there. A childhood surgery left him with even more visible damage, and he suffered from horrific acne in his teens that caused permanent pockmarks and scars. This led his schoolmates to call him Scarface, leaving the young Sinatra furious. But what better revenge than going on to become a Hollywood heartthrob? Frank Sinatra's parents were born in Italy and emigrated to the US when they were young. When Sinatra was a child, his father fought as a lightweight boxer under the name of Marty O'Brien. Frank Sinatra's mother, Dolly, was incredibly active in the community. Between stints as a midwife, she also was a community leader for local democratic causes, and even chained herself to City Hall as part of the women's suffrage movement. It's rumored that the family had mob connections, and Sinatra's parents ran a bar during the Prohibition era. More on this later. It was at the family's bar where Sinatra would first express his desire to perform. He would sing songs while standing on top of the player piano for change from the barflies. Sinatra spent the next few years splitting his time between more traditional jobs and singing gigs around the New Jersey area. It was during this era that he got a life-changing gig singing at a roadhouse in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. Sinatra thought of this as his big break, but he'd quickly become entangled in local drama. The young singer became involved with Tony Della Penta, but behind the scenes, he had a dirty little secret. Sinatra had been cheating on her with another girl, Nancy Barbato. The two girls feuded, and Della Penta ended up suffering a miscarriage. Sinatra's reaction was shocking. After Della Penta attacked Barbato, Sinatra told her that it was over, and that he only wanted to be with Barbato, saying that she was pregnant, when she wasn't. Della Penta was furious and went to law enforcement, who then detained Sinatra on charges of seduction. Della Penta herself was even detained for another fight with Barbato, but Sinatra had made up his mind. He married Barbato later that year. The picture many of us have of Sinatra as classy, well-dressed, sophisticated, is pretty different from his original public image as a skinny, slightly awkward teenage heartthrob in his early days as a radio and movie star in the 1940s. It was only in the early 1950s when Sinatra signed a record deal with Capitol and was paired with legendary music arranger Nelson Riddle that he would build himself this new image that we all know today. Frank Sinatra once said, "The only two people I've ever been afraid of are my mother and Tommy Dorsey." Dorsey was a famous band leader who recruited Sinatra to sing for him in 1939. Sinatra was an instant success, but behind the scenes, it wasn't all acclaim and applause. He feuded with drummer Buddy Rich, but even worse, he was stuck in an unfair contract with Dorsey, which signed away a large portion of his lifetime earnings in entertainment. Sinatra knew he'd have to do something drastic. Based on the screams of fans alone, Sinatra knew that he was famous enough to strike out on his own and be a huge success. And so, he sued to break his unfair contract with Dorsey. Sinatra eventually won, and the band leader's reaction was utterly cold-blooded. Dorsey would insult Sinatra to the press until he passed on in 1956. But he may have had good reason to. It was around this time that dark rumors about a possible involvement with the mob began to plague Frank Sinatra. People began to whisper that Sinatra had gotten out of his contract in a more chilling way than was reported, that he'd gotten one of his mob buddies to threaten Dorsey until the band leader agreed to let him go for a few $1,000s. Whether or not that was true, these types of stories about underworld ties would continue to plague Sinatra. Sinatra's publicist, George Evans, decided that the young star could use a helping hand. So he held auditions to see which girls could scream the loudest, and then paid them to strategically sit in spots that would maximize the noise coming from the audience, all to help create the hype around the young star as he launched his solo career. Sinatra might not have needed the help. His fans were devoted to him, to an almost terrifying degree. They tried to get into his hotel rooms just so they could touch the bed where he slept, or rip the clothing right off his back. In one disturbing incident, nearly 35,000 fans started a riot when they couldn't enter an already full venue where he was performing. One rumor that never left Sinatra his entire life was the claim that he was closely connected to the mafia. There may be good reason for this. He not only posed with prominent members of the Chicago Mafia in photographs, but even sang at the family wedding of Willie Moretti, a known member of the Genovese mob, in 1948. Maybe that's why he called Chicago my kind of town. It was rumored that all of these mob ties were more than just friendships for Sinatra. Some credit his relationship with these notable figures for helping his career take off. How much he benefited from his ties is unclear, but later down the line, they'd come back to haunt him. Comedian Jackie Mason reported that after making fun of old Blue Eyes in one of his acts, he was threatened and roughened up by gangsters in his hotel room. Adding to suspicions that Sinatra had close ties to the mafia, famous gangster Sam Giancana was known to have worn a sapphire friendship ring at all times, reportedly given to him as a gift by none other than Frank himself. The 1940s had lots of highs and lows for Frank Sinatra and his wife Nancy. They had 3 children and moved from New Jersey to Hollywood, but it was after this move that Sinatra began to regularly cheat on Nancy with different women. In 1945, he began to have an affair with starlet and old friend Marilyn Maxwell, and in 1949, the tabloids caught him and Judy Garland on a romantic vacation. Sinatra simply couldn't stop cheating on Nancy. While this wasn't the last straw for Nancy, her patience was spent. But Sinatra had more to worry about than just his frustrated wife. The singer suffered from severe depression, and while he could often hide it well, he would suffer from erratic and brutal mood swings that would cause him to lash out at those around, occasionally with force. Of course, these outbursts would only attract more scrutiny, creating a cycle that would later culminate in a horrific incident. The story goes that Sinatra promised himself he would marry movie star Ava Gardner the very first moment he saw a photo of her in a magazine. He was smitten from the first time they met, but she was initially unimpressed. Finally, she warmed to him, and they began a passionate affair. He was utterly obsessed with her. He knew he had to be with her, but at what cost? In 1950, Sinatra had been married to Nancy for nearly a decade. They'd had 3 children together and weathered his rise to fame. But when Sinatra told Nancy that he'd been having an affair with Ava Gardner, it was the last straw. She locked him out of the house and contacted a lawyer. The date that the couple announced their separation? Well, that was Valentine's Day of 1950. That must have been fun. With his divorce from Nancy pending, Sinatra was finally free to be with Ava Gardner. Once Sinatra's divorce from Nancy was finalized, he wed Ava Gardner in a small ceremony in 1951. He was finally with the woman of his dreams, but their marriage was no fairy tale. Both loved their vices, from drinks to gambling, and they frequently got into brutal fights and altercations that would land them, once again, on the pages of the tabloids. Less than 2 years after they were married, they announced their separation. But their story didn't end there. Thanks to his highly publicized affair with and subsequent rocky marriage to Gardner, Sinatra's career was floundering. Where he'd once sold out huge rooms 3 times over, he could barely fill a 1,200-seat theater. He had to ask 2 different record labels to borrow $200,000 to pay back taxes. One rejected him, and one lent him the money, but both later dropped him. In the early 1950s, when his career was at a devastating low point, Frank Sinatra stumbled upon a crowd of young girls, lining up to see young singing star Eddie Fisher. In what was probably his darkest moment, Sinatra saw this scene and immediately felt that the world no longer wanted him, leading him to attempt suicide by sticking his head in his oven. Thankfully, his manager walked in just in time to save his life. The good thing about being at rock bottom is there's only one way to go, and Sinatra's work in From Here to Eternity got him an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor, sparking a comeback for the embattled star. There are differing stories as to how he got the part. While some biographers have said it was Gardiner who pushed for it, other rumors said that he'd used his mob connections to pressure the producers to give him the part. Following his comeback in the mid-50s, no one could touch Sinatra's success for the next decade. His albums were hits, his films were critically acclaimed, and he was constantly surrounded by not only the Rat Pack, but also a large group of A-list stars. Life was good. It was around this time he met his friend Joe DiMaggio's new wife, a blonde bombshell by the name of Marilyn Monroe. During this time, Sinatra was also involved with a number of other women, including model Angie Dickinson and actress Juliet Prowse. Following in the footsteps of his mother, who was once a ward leader for the Democratic Party, Sinatra was very politically active for most of his life and worked to drum up votes for Democratic candidates. He had a long friendship with John F. Kennedy and often campaigned for him, but the relationship also put him in a great deal of jeopardy. Sinatra's mob connections were unimpressed with his proximity to the Kennedys, who were using their power to crack down on the mob. Regardless, Sinatra stayed close to Kennedy until the president dealt him a heartbreaking betrayal. Frank Sinatra was John F. Kennedy's biggest and most outspoken celebrity supporter, and was even the headline performer at Kennedy's inaugural ball. However, this relationship abruptly fell apart after Kennedy snubbed Sinatra on a 1962 visit to California, when the president elected to stay with singer Bing Crosby instead of staying at Sinatra's home as planned. Sinatra was reportedly so offended by the snub that he personally smashed the concrete heliport that had been built for the occasion with a sledgehammer. Sinatra had remained a devoted father even after his divorce from Nancy, but he lived through every parent's worst nightmare. On the evening of December 8, 1963, Frank Sinatra Jr. was kidnapped from his hotel room in Tahoe. Soon after, a call came through with the kidnappers' demands. They wanted money, Sinatra's money. The kidnappers asked for $240,000, about $2 million in today's money, and told him to only call them through payphones. Sinatra began carrying rolls of dimes in case he needed to call them, a habit that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He gathered the money and prepared for the exchange. Thankfully, after 2 days in captivity, Frank Jr. was released, but the stress and trauma stayed with Sinatra for the rest of his life. Sinatra was making a film with the Rat Pack at the time that his son went missing, and on top of that, he was mourning the loss of an old friend. President John F. Kennedy had been shot just weeks before the kidnapping. They'd never had the chance to reconcile after their falling out. It got so bad that Sinatra considered ceasing production completely, but eventually he was able to return to set. When Sinatra was 50, his newest romantic relationship shocked the tabloids. He'd fallen for actress Mia Farrow, who was just 21 years old at the time. Once again, Sinatra was very controlling of his young bride, demanding she give up her career. Surprisingly, she agreed, shocking the nation by leaving the soap opera Peyton Place at the height of her rising star. At this point in her career, Farrow became more known for her high-profile marriage to Sinatra than her acting success. However, an incredible opportunity was about to come knocking. Farrow was offered the prestigious leading role in the classic horror film Rosemary's Baby. Bored of her bland, domestic lifestyle, she agreed to play the role of Rosemary Woodhouse. As the movie's shooting schedule ran over time, Sinatra grew furious and lashed out in a devastating way. Although Sinatra had urged Farrow to quit acting when they wed, he actually planned to cast her in one movie, his passion project, The Detective. And so, when filming for Rosemary's Baby took longer than expected, Sinatra was extremely furious. He recast Jacqueline Bisset in his wife's role and cruelly divorced Farrow. After years of tumultuous marriages and passionate affairs, Sinatra finally met a woman that he could stay with for the rest of his life, Barbara. While they'd stay married for 22 years until Sinatra's passing, they still had their fair share of drama. The relationship had been fraught at times, and Sinatra had a truly hard time coping with the passing of his mother. Sinatra spent time performing at Caesar's Palace in 1977. His mother was planning on coming to see one of his shows, but sadly, she never made it. Dolly Sinatra was traveling in a small plane with 3 others when it crashed on the way to Vegas. There were no survivors. Sinatra was utterly devastated, and he truly never recovered from that day. The tragedy of Dolly's loss ended up becoming one half of a sad and eerie coincidence. Both Sinatra's mother and fellow Rat Pack superstar Dean Martin's son lost their lives in plane crashes on the exact same California mountain, 10 years apart from one another. Sinatra tried to soldier on after learning of the devastating loss, but after performing 2 of the shows he was scheduled to do, he couldn't take it anymore. He walked away and canceled the rest of his shows at Caesar's Palace. Sinatra lived one of the most fascinating lives of the 20th century, so it's not surprising that biographers were chomping at the bit to get his story down on paper as he entered his golden years. And that's not even to mention the unofficial biographers. One in particular was feared by old Hollywood stars, Kitty Kelly. When it was announced that Sinatra was her next target, he was furious and determined to make her pay. Sinatra filed a lawsuit worth $2 million in order to prevent Kelly from writing her unofficial biography of him, which was going to talk about his marriages, affairs, and connections to the mob. Who knows the reason why? Maybe it's because what appeared in her book was too close to the truth, but either way, he dropped the suit, and Kelly's book was released to critical acclaim and quickly became a bestseller. His secrets were out. The ordeal took a toll on Sinatra's health, and his daughter blamed Kelly for many of his problems in the 80s. Still, he didn't want to stop performing, and he reunited the Rat Pack in 1987, but it quickly devolved into a total nightmare. The interpersonal dynamics on the tour were totally twisted. First, Sinatra refused to speak to Sammy Davis Jr. because of Davis Jr.'s use of illicit substances. Davis Jr. was also having financial problems and claimed that Sinatra's team had promised him millions of dollars just to do the tour, but instead, he claimed that he watched as Sinatra's guys lined their pockets with his cash every single night. Everything changed, however, when Sammy Davis Jr. was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1989. As one of the legs of the tour finished up, Sinatra presented Davis with a gold watch to thank him for being there. Soon after, Davis Jr. passed away and was buried with the gold watch that his old friend Sinatra had given them. It was a sad ending to their friendship, but not as sad as what happened with Dean Martin. The tour had been announced 9 months after Dean Martin's son had been the victim of a plane crash on the same mountain where Sinatra's mother had lost her life, and Martin wasn't handling it well. He was drinking a lot and depending on other substances to get through his grief. Within the first few shows, it was clear that neither Martin's head nor heart was in it. He even threw a lit smoke into the audience at one of the performances. After just 5 shows, Martin left the tour. His failure to get it together caused a huge rift in his friendship with Sinatra, and sadly, the pair never spoke again. After returning from the disastrous tour, Sinatra's health worsened. His frail state was most apparent in concert, where he would often become confused or forget the lyrics to his own songs. Sinatra's final years were nothing short of a battle for his life. He suffered from heart problems, breathing issues, pneumonia, dementia, and bladder cancer. The entire time, his wife Barbara was by his side. When he suffered a heart attack in May 1998, she begged him to keep fighting. That's when he uttered his heartbreaking final words, "I'm losing." Sinatra passed away that day at the age of 82. Sinatra's funeral was a star-studded gathering, however, with family and scores of A-list friends attending to pay their respects. Sinatra's family put together a heartbreaking series of his favorite things to bury him with, including cherry-flavored lifesavers, Tootsie Rolls, a bottle of Jack Daniels, a pack of Camel cigarettes, a Zippo lighter, a dog biscuit, and a roll of dimes. While Sinatra passed more than 2 decades ago, the story didn't end there. Dark revelations about the star continue to emerge to this day. Following Sinatra's passing, it was revealed that the FBI had kept him under surveillance for 5 whole decades. The reasons were multiple, from his ties to the mob to his close relationship with the Kennedy family. Over the years, the Bureau amassed an impressive file of no less than 2,403 pages on Sinatra. Strangely enough, even more dark revelations have surfaced since. As Mia Farrow's son Ronan grew up, rumors began to spread that he was actually Frank Sinatra's son. Although his mother, Mia Farrow, was with comedian Woody Allen at the time of his birth. Those who have speculated that Sinatra was possibly his true father have recently included Woody Allen, Mia Farrow, and even Ronan himself. This might be a welcome revelation for Ronan, who no longer speaks to his other father, Woody Allen, due to the many discretions he's been accused of. Sinatra's daughter Nancy denied the accusations, but you've got to admit, the man looks a little bit more like old Blue Eyes than Allen. That is going to conclude this video. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like rating, subscribe for more, and we'll be back with a new video very shortly.